Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a royal bedchamber, where the warmest place in an entire medieval castle was not near the throne, not in the great hall, and not even directly beside the fire. It was inside a heavy curtained bed, packed with wool, fur, rocks, warmed sheets, and the fading body heat of a king who was trying, with all the help power could buy, not to spend the night half frozen. If you enjoy these slow walks through the stranger corners of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Then dim the room, loosen your jaw, let your breathing slow, and settle in. Tonight we are going to move through frost, stone, curtain folds, and old winter habits. And by the end, you will feel exactly why medieval sleep was less a luxury than a carefully managed truce with cold. I have always found it slightly funny that when people imagine kings, they picture crowns, feasts, velvet, and effortless comfort, as though a crown automatically came with central heating. It did not. In a harsh medieval winter, a king could command armies, dismiss bishops, ruin a rival, and still wake up with a cold nose, aching fingers, and a bedroom that felt like the inside of a stone well. That is the truth, waiting under all the pageantry, and it gives these chambers a human sadness that I find strangely beautiful. The source we are following begins not with warmth, but with the castle itself. That is the right place to begin, because the whole problem starts there. Castles were built to resist invasion, not to flatter comfort. Their thick walls repelled arrows and held towers upright, but they also stored cold with a kind of grim devotion. The same narrow windows that protected the people inside from attack admitted very little light and almost no useful warmth. The same high ceilings that made halls impressive also allowed precious heat to drift upward and vanish into dark rafters where no sleeping body could reach it. Imagine yourself moving through one of those corridors at night. The hour is late. Candles burn low in iron brackets. Their flames bend and tremble whenever a hidden draft slides through the passage. Your boots strike uneven stone, and each step releases a hollow echo that seems to travel far longer than it should. The air has that mineral smell very old buildings sometimes keep, as if water, dust, and cold have spent centuries settling into the same joints in the wall. You breathe in and the cold seems almost metallic. Not sharp enough to wound, but sharp enough to remind you that your lungs are entering a place not designed for softness. The source describes this very well. You are meant to feel that the castle is almost mountain-like. I think that is exactly right. It is easy for modern minds to romanticize old stone until we forget how much stone can behave like stored winter. You put your hand against the wall, and it is colder than the back of a spoon left near a window on a January night. You pull your sleeve over your fingers without meaning to. That tiny gesture says everything. Even before you meet the king, the room is already teaching you how people survived here, by instinct, by layers, by little habits of defense. And defense is the word that matters most. Even sleep was defensive. That is one of the deepest truths in the source. In a modern bedroom, sleep is usually imagined as surrender. You lower the lights, settle the blanket, and let the body disappear into rest. In a medieval castle during winter, especially for a king, sleep was more like a fortified retreat. You did not simply fall into bed. You prepared a position. You made calculations. You trapped heat where you could. You controlled drafts. You insulated your skin, your feet, your chest, your bed frame, your curtains, your floor. Every detail had to be coaxed into cooperation. If you were standing with me in that corridor, just outside the royal chamber, you would probably notice another strange thing. The deeper you move into the private rooms, the quieter the castle becomes, but not more peaceful, just more focused. Somewhere below, servants are still awake. Firewood is being shifted. Embers are being checked. A jug of heated liquid is being carried with both hands because the hallway stones are treacherous and a spill would waste warmth that matters. Somewhere, a sleepy guard adjusts his cloak and stamps one foot gently against the floor because numbness has begun creeping into his toes. None of this is grand. All of it is essential. That is why I have always liked these histories of ordinary discomfort more than the histories of battle sometimes. A war tells you what a king could order. A winter bedchamber tells you what he could not control. The door to the chamber is thick, banded, practical. You push through it, and the first surprise is not warmth, but how little warmer it feels than the corridor you just left. There may be a fireplace at the far side of the room. There may be rugs across the floor. There may be tapestries on the walls. There may be more candlelight. But the room is still made of stone, still full of drafts, still vulnerable to the large, calm cruelty of winter, waiting on the other side of the shutters. The king has not escaped cold. He has only narrowed the terms of his negotiation with it. I think that is why the source frames the whole chamber almost like a battlefield position. It sounds dramatic at first, but the more you sit with it, the more reasonable it becomes. The fire helps, yes, but much of its heat rises and disappears. The walls remain cold. The windows leak. The floor tries to steal warmth from every shoe sole, every bare ankle, every forgotten object. There is no central heating, no even temperature, no gentle background comfort. Only zones. Near the fire, less bad. Near the tapestries, perhaps a little less raw. On the rugs, tolerable. By the windows, miserable. At the bed, if everything has been prepared carefully, survivable. And that brings us to the most important object in the room, the bed. Honestly, medieval royal beds are some of the most misunderstood pieces of furniture in history. Modern people see the carvings, the height, the canopy, the drapery, and assume they are looking at decoration, display, theater. They are looking at those things, yes, but they are also looking at a machine for trapping heat. A fortress inside the fortress. A room within the room. The bed was not just where the king slept. It was where the king withdrew from the coldest parts of the castle and attempted to create a small climate of his own body. Picture it emerging from the half-light as your eyes adjust. Massive posts. A canopy overhead. Heavy curtains hanging in folds thick enough to look almost architectural. A bed frame wider than you expect. Not because the medieval world was devoted to sprawling luxury in the modern hotel sense, but because space allowed for layered bedding, bolsters, blankets, attend, and the practical theater of getting a ruler settled for the night. The frame rises from the dimness like a wooden house built on legs. There is something slightly solemn about it, almost altar-like, almost defensive. It seems to say, this is where warmth will be concentrated, and everything in the room must serve that purpose. The source lingers on this, and rightly so. Beds like these were carefully prepared because a king who slept badly might wake irritable, stiff, ill, and very dangerous to be around before breakfast. That amused me a little the first time I thought it through. Whole chains of servants, logs, textile, and warming devices, all moving so that one man might wake with a better temper. History is grand in the chronicles and faintly ridiculous in the bedroom, which is one reason it feels so human. You step closer and lay a hand against the carved wood. It is ancient, dense, and surprisingly cold. That matters. Even the bed itself had to be conquered by preparation. Wood held less cold than stone, certainly, but not enough to save anyone by itself. Under the mattress, there are cords stretched tightly across the frame, supporting the bedding above. These cords had to be checked, tightened, and adjusted. A sagging bed meant poor rest, and poor rest meant complaints, and complaints around monarchs had a way of becoming someone else, problem very quickly. There is a small humor in the old phrase, sleep tight, being traced back to those cords. A phrase that sounds gentle now once belonged to furniture maintenance. Look below the bed and you see the rugs. Thick. Necessary. Their job is not simply beauty. They blunt the bite of the floor. They interrupt the cold that rises from stone. That detail matters because cold in these rooms moved like water, settling low, sliding under furniture, touching ankles first, then calves, then the underside of the bed itself. Every rug was a kind of barrier. Modest, imperfect, important. Now lift your eyes again to the curtains around the bed. This is where the whole strategy starts becoming obvious. These are not airy, theatrical drapes fluttering prettily in a summer draft. They are substantial, dense, practical. Their weight alone tells you what they were for. Once drawn closed, they create a smaller enclosure around the sleeper, trapping body heat, slowing air movement, and softening the room into a contained pocket of survivable warmth. You do not heat the whole chamber. That would be nearly impossible. You heat the human, the bed, the enclosed breathing space. You reduce the problem until it can be fought. I have always thought that is one of the smartest things about medieval winter sleep. It is humble in its logic. The castle cannot be made comfortable. So the bed becomes a kingdom small enough to govern. And even then, the warmth is fragile. That is another point the source handles beautifully. We should not imagine these beds as miracles of comfort in the modern sense. The cold was not defeated. It was slowed. The curtains helped, but a draft could still creep under them. The blankets helped, but a shift in sleep could pull one aside. The fire helped, but only so far. The king, for all his resources, was still living inside a system of partial victories. Imagine him entering the room late at night. He has eaten, He has spoken with attendants. Perhaps he has warmed his hands near the hearth. Perhaps he has already begun to feel that particular weariness winter brings, the heaviness in the joints, the desire to stop fighting the air and simply get inside the bed. The curtains are drawn back for him. The mattress has been arranged. The blankets are waiting. Yet before he gets in, the bed must still be checked like a position before battle. The cords firm enough. The sheets not too cold. The warming devices removed or adjusted. The pillows arranged for the semi-upright posture many elites preferred. Every step matters. The semi-upright sleeping position is another one of those little facts people remember because it sounds odd. And odd facts travel well. But it does make sense in the world view of the time. Digestion, humors, breathing. All of these were thought to be influenced by posture. So the bed was not just a soft place. It was shaped around a theory of the body. Cushions and bolsters raised the sleepers slightly. The king would not simply stretch flat like someone in a modern mattress ad. He would settle into a supported angle, wrapped, propped, enclosed. I think that image is wonderfully intimate. Not because it is luxurious, though it is, but because it makes the king look human again. Cold, slightly fussy, dependent on good bedding and careful servants, hoping the arrangement will hold until morning. The same man who could command punishments, taxes, alliances, or executions, is now standing in a drafty room, thinking, in essence, I hope this bed is warm enough. And that may be the strangest comfort of all in this subject. Power did not remove the body. It only surrounded the body with more elaborate attempts to protect it. So let the room settle around you now. The fire breathing low in the distance. The tapestries hanging against the walls like extra layers of cloth for the chamber itself. The rugs muting your steps. The bed dominating the room with its canopy and curtains, waiting like a private shelter. Outside the shutters, the winter remains patient. It is still there. It will still be there at dawn. But for the next few hours, everything inside this chamber will be devoted to building one small island of heat around the sleeper at the center. And in the next movement, we are going to go deeper into that island, into the blankets, the furs, the curtains, the heavy layers that made a royal bed less like a mattress and more like a carefully built cocoon where a king could disappear from the cold for a few uncertain hours. Now that the bed is standing before us clearly, the source draws us closer, right into the layers themselves. And this is where the whole story becomes tactile. You are no longer thinking in broad architectural terms only. You are thinking with your fingers, with your skin, with the small, instinctive reactions your body has when it meets wool, fur, rough linen, and trapped warmth. I think this is where medieval winter sleep becomes easiest to understand, because the strategy is no longer abstract. It is touch. The first thing to notice is weight. Modern bedding often prides itself on feeling light, airy, cloud-like. Medieval royal bedding was not trying to charm you. It was trying to pin warmth in place. The pile on the bed would have looked substantial even before anyone slipped beneath it. Blankets folded back in thick ridges. Fur coverings heavier than they appeared. Linen layers tucked beneath wool. Bolsters gathered near the head. Perhaps a decorative coverlet on top. Yes, but even decoration in such a room had work to do. The bed did not merely promise comfort. It promised resistance against the cold that never really left the room. You reach out and press your palm into the uppermost layer. It gives slowly. Not the bounce of modern filling, but a dense yielding, as though the fabric is holding its shape through discipline rather than softness. I have always liked that detail, because it tells you something about the whole medieval approach to comfort. Comfort was constructed, dense, managed, a little stern, less like floating on warmth, more like being held down by it until the body stopped losing heat quite so fast. The source spends time with wool, and it should. Wool was one of the great medieval answers to winter. Thick enough to trap warmth, durable enough to survive use and repair, common enough to be central even when luxury fabrics entered the picture. For kings, of course, the quality could be extraordinary. Dyed cloths, finer weaves, better finishing. Imported textiles, perhaps. But the principle remained the same. Warmth depended on fiber that could hold air, block drafts, and survive the wear of repeated winters. Lift one corner of the blanket and imagine the drag of it in your hand. There is effort in that movement. A little resistance. The cloth is not delicate. It is purposeful, perhaps slightly coarse at the surface, though softened by use. You let it fall and hear that soft, heavy collapse thick fabric makes, a sound almost too gentle for how much labor it took to weave. Somewhere in that sound is the work of sheep, dyers, weavers, washers, menders, storerooms, servants, and the long practical memory of people who understood that a bad blanket in winter could become the most important failure in a room. Under one wool layer there may be linen. The source notes this too, and it matters. Linen against the skin. Wool above. Different textures for different jobs. Linen absorbs, softens, separates roughness from the body. Wool traps heat. The combination is ancient, sensible, and intimate in a way modern duvets can never quite reproduce. You slide your fingers under the edge of one layer and find another cooler one beneath. Smoother, denser, quieter. Bedding becomes geology here. Strata. One solution laid over another. And then the furs. I admit there is something melancholy and magnificent about fur in these rooms. Fur is warmth taken directly from one living body to protect another. Sable, marten, fox, beaver in some contexts, each carrying not only insulation but status. The source is right to point out that fur worked beautifully because it trapped heat so well. Once the king had settled beneath the layers and his body had begun warming the enclosed pocket around him, the fur helped hold that little private climate together. But fur also announced rank. Not everyone slept under such wealth. Warmth could be luxurious. Luxury could also simply mean not being miserable. Imagine brushing your fingertips backward against the direction of the fur. The pile resists. Then smooth it down again, and it lies obediently in one direction, catching candlelight in a dull glow. It is warm almost before it is warm, if that makes sense. It looks insulating. It promises shelter just by texture. I think medieval people would have understood that promise immediately, perhaps more deeply than we do, because the cold in their lives was not an inconvenience managed by thermostats. It was a recurring physical threat. The source also mentions waxed cloth beneath some bedding layers, partly to deter pests, partly because it trapped some heat and protected the mattress from dampness and intrusion. That detail pleased me more than I expected. It is so practical, so undignified in the best possible way. We tend to imagine royal bedrooms as only ceremonial, but winter quickly strips away the fantasy. Pest control, heat retention, draft reduction. These are not glamorous ideas. Yet they may decide whether a king sleeps well enough to wake without aching. You know that feeling when an expensive object suddenly becomes more interesting because you learn what humble problem it solved. That is the royal bed here. It is not just carved authority. It is a giant solution to the fact that cold creeps, insects creep, damp creeps, and sleep itself can go badly when the body loses warmth too fast. There is another curious tenderness in the source when it describes how the king actually entered the bedding. Slowly, deliberately, perhaps with help. That makes sense. You do not leap into a bed like this. You are arranged into it. Covers are lifted. The body settles. Layers are drawn up again around the chest and shoulders. Blankets are adjusted so that openings are minimized. Feet are tucked toward the warmest part. Cushions are checked. It is half bedtime, half engineering, and if that sounds excessive, consider the alternative. A cold bed in such a chamber would have been a small catastrophe. The first contact between body and chilled sheets can ruin an entire evening even now. Multiply that by stone walls, poorer heating, harsher drafts, and a body already tired from cold surroundings, and you begin to see why attendants treated this process with so much seriousness. The first few minutes in bed mattered enormously. If the sleeper could gather warmth quickly, the rest of the night had a chance. If not, he might shiver for an hour and never reach true rest. That is where the curtains re-enter the story as more than decoration. I think the source is especially good on this point. The curtains around the bed created a second shell. Once drawn shut, they made the air inside the bed space quieter, stiller, less vulnerable to the random little currents that crossed the chamber. I have stepped into old curtain beds in preserved historic houses before, and even without real medieval cold, you can feel the logic instantly. The world narrows. Sound softens. The air changes. You are no longer exposed to the whole room. You are in a pocket. A pocket is the right word. The medieval king did not warm the chamber. He inhabited a pocket of warmth assembled around his own body and everything prepared for him. Imagine standing just outside the curtains. The room is cool. You can feel a slight movement of air across the back of your hand. Now pull the curtain aside and lean into the enclosed space. The difference is not tropical, not miraculous, but distinct. There is less motion in the air, less sudden cold. The warmth that does exist can gather and stay close enough to matter. This small difference might be the one that keeps your breathing from turning sharp and your muscles from tensing all night. That is why I have always thought Enclosed beds are among the most psychologically revealing pieces of furniture in history. They do not merely express wealth, they express mistrust of the room. The room is too large, too cold, too drafty, too unreliable. So the sleeper creates a second room inside it, one with fabric walls and a lower roof and a smaller volume of air to tame. It is a humble brilliance hidden inside grandeur. The source also mentions seasonal curtain changes, heavier curtains for winter, lighter ones for summer, and that detail adds another layer of quiet intelligence. These households adapted. They did not passively suffer the seasons. They modified fabrics, layers, positions, routines. A winter bed was an engineered response to a known enemy. I like that image. Winter not as a dramatic surprise every year, but as an old adversary whose habits were well understood. Even the floor under the bed area had to join the strategy. Rugs. Again. Perhaps multiple ones. Thick enough to soften sound. Yes. But also to reduce the upward chill from stone. If you step off the rug barefoot in a cold old room, the lesson arrives instantly. The floor is not neutral. It steals. It takes heat from you with a kind of patient confidence. Covering it was as much part of sleep preparation as arranging the blankets. And all of these things, the blankets, curtains, rugs, mattress stuffing, cords, pillows, were shaped by maintenance. That may be the least romantic and most important detail of all. Bedding had to be brushed, aired, beaten, repaired, checked for pests, dried when necessary, stored correctly, handled correctly. Nothing about medieval comfort was passive. It was labor. The source notes that heavy textiles were valuable possessions, guarded and preserved. Of course they were. To own warmth in a cold world is no small thing. You protect it. You mend it. You do not let it rot. Imagine servants taking those blankets out into pale winter daylight on a day dry enough to allow it. They shake them. Dust rises. Cold air bites their hands. The cloth resists and settles and carries some faint, trapped scent of smoke, wool oil, herbs, maybe human sleep itself. That was all part of preserving the king ability to rest. Even the luxury of sleep had a supply chain. I have always found that oddly comforting. It reminds you that comfort is never as simple as it feels when you finally reach it. There are always hidden hands behind it. The source also makes the subtle point that the bed projected status. Of course it did. Beds for rulers were not secret objects. They were seen, described, entered ceremonially at times, discussed, embiid. The bed declared that the body inside it mattered more than other bodies nearby. The warmth concentrated there was a visible sign of hierarchy. I think that is one reason the carvings, heraldic symbols, and expensive fabrics mattered even inside a winter context. The bed had to keep the king warm. It also had to look like the center of a kingdom. That mix of practicality and symbolism gives the object a strange gravity. It is a place of sleep, yes, but it is also a statement. Here lies the person around whom the rest of this chamber is organized. Here is where labor converges. Here is where warmth is rationed most generously. Here is where curtains will close, and the difference between royal comfort and everyone else's discomfort becomes visible in the dark. There is something almost monastic about the final moment before the curtains close. The king has changed. The bedding is ready. The chamber has been arranged. Perhaps a servant lifts the last heavy layer into place over him. Perhaps another smooths the edge of a blanket near the shoulder. A candle burns low. Someone draws the curtains inward. The opening narrows. Room sounds dim slightly. The bed becomes its own little night world. Outside that world, the chamber still exists in draught and cold and stone. Inside it, warmth can begin accumulating from body, fabric, and whatever preparations were made beforehand. And that is the key word: accumulating. Nothing in this bed is instantly warm. The system works by build-up, layer over layer, breath after breath. Body heat held rather than wasted. Air kept still rather than stirred. The first warmth is slight, then more noticeable, then almost precious. The king has to remain inside it, protect it, avoid letting too much cold in. A careless opening of curtains, a blanket shifted too far, a foot left uncovered. These small things matter. Honestly, that fragility is what makes the whole scene feel so intimate to me. It is not the story of conquering winter. It is the story of building a small tenderness inside it. And we are not finished yet, because the bed alone could not solve the problem. Blankets and curtains were the core of the system. Yes, but they relied on timing, preparation, and hands. Servants warmed things, adjusted things, brought in heated tools, tested the sheets, managed the first crucial moments before the king climbed under the covers. In the next movement, we will go to those hands and those preparations, the quiet labor behind royal sleep, where warmth had to be carried, tucked, lifted, and guarded before the monarch could enter his private cocoon at all. The bed may have been the center of warmth, but it did not warm itself. That is the next truth the source wants us to feel, and I think it may be the most intimate one of all. Royal sleep in winter was never only about the king, and never only about furniture. It was about hands. Other people's hands. People who entered the chamber before the ruler arrived, who moved through the half-cold room carrying linens, coals, kettles, cloths, jugs, braziers, and their own fading warmth. All so that one body of great importance might not spend the night locked in a fight with freezing air. I have always thought there is something almost liturgical about old bedtime routines when survival depends on them. The actions repeat. The objects return. The order matters. A sheet is lifted. A blanket is shaken. A warming device is passed under the linen. Curtains are held back, then released. A servant checks the mattress with the flat of a palm. Another listens to the fire. Another watches for sparks, because one careless ember could turn comfort into catastrophe in a matter of minutes. Nothing is casual. The chamber becomes a workshop of temporary heat. Imagine the room before the king enters. The candles are trimmed lower now. The larger business of court has thinned away into private necessity. You hear quieter sounds. Fabric brushing fabric. The lid of a metal vessel set down carefully on wood. A soft mutter between attendants who know the room well enough not to need full sentences. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of purpose. Everyone is moving gently because gentleness preserves what little warmth has been gathered. Sudden movement lifts curtains. Openings spill heat. Doors left ajar waste effort. The whole room seems to ask for restraint. The source is very good on this point. Warmth in a medieval royal chamber was a managed event. It did not happen in one triumphant gesture. It accumulated through stages, and each stage depended on labor. First, the fire had to be coaxed to the right strength, not too low, or the room would remain hostile. Not too wild, or smoke and sparks would become trouble. Then bedding had to be opened and aired only as much as needed. If linens sat exposed too long, they lost the benefit of preparation. If blankets were stacked carelessly, warmed pockets of air escaped before the sleeper ever touched them. This is where servants became the true keepers of the king's private climate. I have always liked that phrase, private climate. It sounds almost modern, yet it fits these old rooms perfectly. One man might wear the crown, but 10 quieter people could determine whether he spent the night shivering. That fact gives the room a political tenderness. Power rested on service even here, in the softest and most hidden part of the day. The body of the king was publicly glorious and privately dependent. The source also suggests, and history strongly supports, that servants often used warmed cloths and warmed bodies to chase the first chill from the bedding. That detail always lands with a small shock of humanity. The sheets must not greet the ruler like ice. So what happens? They are rubbed, folded around heated objects, held near a fire without scorching. Sometimes even pressed with the warmth of a servant who becomes, for a few minutes, part of the heating system of the room. It is easy to laugh a little at that, and honestly I think a little laughter is fair. History is dignified from a distance and wonderfully awkward up close. But it is also moving. Warmth was personal. Picture a servant standing beside the bed with sleeves rolled back, testing the inside of a sheet with the back of the wrist. That is such a practical old gesture. The back of the wrist knows cold immediately. If the cloth still bites there, it is not ready. Another servant lifts the blanket edge and tucks in a stone wrapped in wool for a little longer. Someone else turns toward the hearth to fetch another warmed linen bundle. The room smells faintly of smoke, lanolin, hot cloth, perhaps a trace of rosemary or lavender crushed into bedding to soften the atmosphere. Outside the curtains of the bed, the chamber remains stubbornly cold. Inside, these little acts are building a gentler weather. The source hints at unofficial bed warmers as well, and while the specifics could vary from household to household, the logic is impossible to miss. Before the royal body entered the bed, another body or a heated substitute might briefly occupy part of that space to drive out the first harsh chill. It sounds odd to modern ears only because we are spoiled by mechanical heat. In a room where fabric and flesh are the main tools for attaining warmth, it makes complete sense. A mattress and sheet can feel dead cold. A mattress and sheet that have been breathed into, pressed into, lived in, even for a short while, feel transformed. You know that feeling when you slip into a bed that someone has just vacated, and the warmth left behind feels almost startlingly intimate. Multiply that by a world without radiators, with stone walls and thin winter light, and you begin to understand why pre-warming by human presence was not a strange indulgence. It was a practical mercy. The source also emphasizes the timing of all this, and timing really was everything. If the king delayed too long after the bed had been prepared, much of the gained warmth would fade. If he arrived too early, before the system was ready, the whole careful ritual might fail in its most important first minutes. Servants, therefore, lived by anticipation. They had to know the rhythm of the evening, when the meal would end, when prayers would conclude, whether conversation might linger, whether a messenger might delay everything. The room had to be warm at the correct moment, not merely warmed in general. That is a subtle burden, and I think it tells us a great deal about the intelligence of service in aristocratic households. True service is often nothing more glamorous than timing done correctly. Imagine the strain of that in winter. A servant glancing toward the chamber door, listening for steps that have not yet come. The sheet is ready now, perhaps. But if the king stops in another room for half an hour, the top layer cools. Do you reopen the curtains? Do you pass the warming pan again? Do you risk overdrying the cloth near the fire? Do you wait? Every choice matters. The room is a clock made of heat loss. I have always found that more compelling than grand ceremony. A coronation happens once. Good bed preparation had to happen night after night. And then there is the question of touch. The source never says this bluntly, but it is there in every line. Servants had to handle the king's sleeping space with care that was both practical and political. This was intimate labor performed under hierarchy. Pillows adjusted near where the royal head would rest. Covers drawn near where the royal skin would soon lie. The final arrangements made not in a public hall, but in the narrow private zone where rulership became simply one cold person, hoping not to be uncomfortable for the next 6 or 7 hours. There is a hush to that kind of service, a discipline, perhaps even a little sympathy, depending on the household and the personalities involved. If you were standing in the chamber with them, you would notice how little wasted motion there is. One servant straightens a fold in the linen. Another checks that the inner curtain edge will close cleanly without leaving a gap. Another turns a warming pan one last time, then hands it away. The bedclothes rise and settle, like careful breathing. Nothing is showy. Everything is directed toward one result: a smooth transition from cold room to warm enclosure. The source also reminds us that heat was fleeting. I keep returning to that because it is the emotional core of the whole scene. In our world, warmth can be made background. In theirs, it remained eventful. You earned it. You prepared it. You noticed when it arrived, and noticed immediately when it failed. A servant who let the bed grow cold again after preparing it badly had not made a tiny mistake. He had let winter reclaim territory. That may sound melodramatic until you imagine bare linen in a stone room after sunset. There is another layer of labor here too, the labor of preserving the labor that came before. A blanket had been woven, a fur prepared, Linen bleached, washed, mended, folded, the mattress filled and refluffed, the curtains brushed and rehung, firewood cut, seasoned, hauled, stacked, and burned, warm stones heated elsewhere, metal tools kept serviceable. Every gesture in the chamber rests on older gestures you do not see. I have always thought historical comfort is easiest to understand when you notice its invisible chain. Nothing arrives by itself. Even a warm sheet has a biography. And because the source is so rooted in winter, it lets us feel how quickly all this could go wrong. A servant opens the bed too early. A warming cloth cools on the walk from fire to mattress. A coal in the pan dies faster than expected. A draft slips in through a door left open a little too long. The king arrives in a worse mood than usual and rushes the process. These tiny things matter because the difference between manageable cold and miserable cold is often made of tiny things. You know that feeling when one small error at bedtime ruins the whole night. A pillow off by an inch. A blanket twisted. A window not quite latched. Medieval sleep was full of such fragile thresholds. I think that is why the room takes on a near sacred quality in the source. Not because kings were holy in a theological sense simply by lying down, but because the scene is built from concentrated attention. This fabric here, this stone warmed and wrapped, this fold tucked in, this candle moved so the wax does not drip, this curtain held aside, this curtain closed. The best servant in such a room is almost invisible because invisibility is part of mastery. The bed ends up seeming naturally welcoming, even though a whole choreography made it so. Picture the final minute before the king enters. The sheets are ready. The top coverings are folded back in an inviting slope. The air inside the curtains is just slightly gentler than the air beyond them. One servant stands near the foot, another near the side. No one wants to speak too loudly. Even language feels like it might cool the room. Outside the bed enclosure, the chamber remains what it has always been. A great box of stone, reluctantly holding a weak fire against winter. Inside the curtains, a smaller kingdom has been built, fragile but real. And then, once the king is in, more labor continues. Covers drawn up, warmth sealed around shoulders, curtains closed. A final check that no hot object remains where it should not. A vessel removed. A candle lowered. Someone waits a few moments longer, in case the king asks for another blanket, another pillow, another adjustment at the feet. Service does not end when the sleeper lies down. It fades gradually, the way embers fade, careful not to disturb what has been made. There is something deeply human in all this that I do not want to lose. Before warmth became automatic, people became one another's climate. They carried comfort toward one another with hands, with timing, with bodily nearness, with patience. That is what this chamber reveals beneath its hierarchy and luxury. Warmth was not abstract. It arrived through people. So let the bed remain there in the dark now, not yet alone, but nearly alone. The warmth inside it newly gathered. The servants retreating step by step from the enclosure they have prepared. The king settling into the little weather they made around him. And as they withdraw, another set of helpers enters our story. Not hands this time, but tools, metal warming pans, heated stones, embers in careful vessels, foot warmers waiting for numb toes. In the next movement, we will follow those small devices, those ingenious bits of risk and comfort, and watch how medieval people tried to carry the hearth itself into the bed without burning the whole chamber down. Once the servants had done everything human hands could do, the source takes us to the tools themselves. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole subject, because it shows just how inventive people become when comfort is scarce and winter is stubborn. There is a special kind of intelligence in old warming devices. They are rarely elegant by modern standards. Some are awkward. Some are risky. Some are almost funny in design. Yet each one exists because somebody long ago looked at a freezing bed, a numb foot, a drafty room, and thought, there must be some better way than suffering quietly until dawn. The first device the source lingers on is the warming pan, and rightly so. It is one of those objects that instantly tells you what kind of world you are in. A long-handled metal pan, often with a lid pierced to release warmth, carrying embers or hot coals that could be passed between the sheets before the sleeper entered. Not fire exactly. Not enough to ignite the bed if used correctly, though enough to do terrible harm if used badly. More like a traveling pocket of the hearth, translated into a shape that could move across linen and mattress and leave behind a path of temporary softness. Imagine the room while one is in use. A servant opens the bed and slides the pan slowly beneath the upper layers. There is a faint rasp of metal against cloth, then the gentler sound of fabric settling over it. The lid glows a little through the punctures, not bright enough to light the room, but enough to make you aware that fire is moving inside the bed where a person will soon lie. I have always found that mix of comfort and danger wonderfully medieval. Warmth was welcome. Warmth was also never entirely tame. The source is good on the sensory detail here, especially the smell. Warming pans did not leave nothing behind. There would be the faint scent of heated iron, perhaps a little charcoal, perhaps the dry, almost toasted smell that cloth can take on when warmth passes close over it. Not smoke in the roaring fireplace sense, but a near scent. A scent that tells the nose some small fire has just been here. If you have ever used an iron or stood near a radiator that has just begun to wake after months of disuse, you know the sort of warning comfort can carry in its smell. And of course there was danger. I think that should be admitted softly but clearly. A warming pan used carelessly could scorch sheets. A coal could spill. Fabric could smolder unnoticed for too long. The room could keep its secrets until far too late. So this was not a toy. It required judgment, steadiness, timing, and the kind of competence that rarely makes history books, but probably saved many beds. Servants had to know how long to pass it, where not to linger, when the heat was enough, and when enough was already too much. You know that feeling when a helpful object comes with just enough danger to make it memorable. That is the warming pan. It is the medieval answer to the sentence, I want the bed warm, but I would prefer not to die in a fire. The source also speaks of heated stones, and I confess I have a particular affection for heated stones as historical companions. They are so simple that they feel almost eternal. a stone warmed near the hearth, wrapped in cloth or wool, then tucked into the bed, often near the feet or along one side where the sleeper might gather close to it without direct contact. Less theatrical than a warming pan. Less dramatic. Possibly safer in some circumstances, and wonderfully patient in the way stone releases heat. Not all at once, but slowly, almost thoughtfully. Picture one being carried from the fire. It is too hot to hold bare, so it comes wrapped in fabric already chosen for the task. The servant cradles it carefully, not because it is precious in itself, but because it contains useful warmth, and useful warmth should never be wasted. Then it is placed under the covers, near the lower end perhaps, where cold is often sharpest. The blankets settle over it. Heat begins to seep outward into the little cave of the bed. Minutes later, when the king slides in, his feet do not meet dead cloth alone. They meet a hidden sun no larger than a loaf of bread. I have always thought that is such a tender image. History, at its gentlest, is often just a warm object placed where pain would otherwise begin. The source mentions hot water vessels too, and they belong in the same family of solutions. A heated liquid contained in metal, leather, or ceramic, carried where needed, positioned near the body, or kept close by as a reserve of warmth. Again, nothing magical. Just heat borrowed from the fire and persuaded to travel farther than flames themselves could. The whole medieval chamber begins to look like a landscape of small migrations. Warmth moving from hearth to vessel, from vessel to bed, from bed to body. There is a quiet poetry in that if you let yourself feel it. Heat is never just there. It journeys, and then there are the feet. The source understands this with admirable seriousness. Cold feet can ruin the whole body. Once they go numb, the rest of sleep becomes a negotiation between discomfort and exhaustion. So medieval winter strategy often treated the feet as a front line. Foot warmers, fur-lined slippers, thick hose, layered wrappings, warm bricks or stones. All of these were ways of defending the most vulnerable extremities against the great downward pull of cold. If you stand by the bed and imagine the king preparing to climb in, you can almost feel the instinct. Toes already cooling from the walk across the room. Floor chill rising through the soul. The desire to get under the covers quickly, but not carelessly. A servant kneels briefly with a warmed object or a pair of fur-lined coverings. Another checks that the stone at the foot has not cooled too far. This is not indulgence. It is triage. The body loses morale through the feet faster than people like to admit. I have always found that very reassuring about history. Even kings were brought low by cold toes. The source also points toward braziers and other small contained heat sources in or near the chamber. These were useful, but again, never uncomplicated. Any free-standing source of heat came with smoke, air quality problems, accident risk, and the simple fact that medieval rooms did not obey modern assumptions about ventilation. A brazier could comfort and suffocate in the same night if handled badly. That is one reason the royal bed remained so central. It was more efficient to warm the immediate sleeping zone than to fight the whole architecture. Still, imagine a small brazier glowing in the corner before sleep. giving off more reassurance than actual room-transforming power. Its little red heart, visible beneath dark metal, the faint clink when it is shifted, the smell of charcoal mixed with pine smoke from the hearth. A servant watching it not because it is impressive, but because it is one more fragile ally in the room's war against winter. There is another class of warming tools the source handles with equal care. Body coverings used after entering bed, fur boots or soft indoor shoes before sleep, thick wool hose that stayed on under blankets, caps at night, even gloves in harsh conditions. Modern people sometimes forget how much heat escapes from extremities and the head, partly because modern houses have made that escape less dramatic. In a medieval chamber, keeping the head warm could matter. Keeping hands from becoming stiff and painful mattered. A king might not go to sleep dressed for war, but he did go to sleep dressed for survival. I like the absurd dignity of a fur cap in a royal bedchamber. There is something almost comic about it until you remember the room is cold enough to justify it. Then the comedy becomes wisdom. Pride is useful in court. Less useful at midnight when the window shutters rattle and your ears are freezing. The source also speaks about the strategic placement of warmth, and that may be the most important phrase in this whole movement. Strategic placement. Not more heat everywhere. Heat where it matters most. Near the feet. Along the side. Under the first contact points of the sheets. At the hands if needed. Near the chest through clothing or hot cloth. The medieval room was not transformed into summer. Small regions of mercy were built inside winter. It is a very different philosophy of comfort from ours, and in some ways a more intelligent one. Stop trying to conquer the whole environment. Protect the most vulnerable points. If you have ever cupped cold hands around a mug, or tucked your feet under a pet, or moved 1 inch nearer to a heater in an otherwise chilly room, you already know this instinct. It is ancient. The difference is that medieval people institutionalized it into an entire culture of devices. There is also the psychological side. The source never loses sight of that. A warm object in the bed does more than warm the body. It reassures the mind. It promises that someone has thought ahead, that the first shock of cold has been anticipated, that the night will not begin with punishment. I think that matters more than we sometimes realize. Sleep is partly physical and partly emotional. A room that feels cared for is easier to surrender to than one that feels neglected. Imagine slipping into the bed and finding, with a little surprised relief, that your feet meet warmth instead of chill. It would change the whole mood of the night. The blankets would no longer feel like defense alone. They would feel like invitation. The source also makes a subtle point that I love. Many of these devices were portable. Warm stones, foot warmers, wrapped vessels, small braziers. They could move. That tells you something very important about medieval winter life. Comfort had to travel because the human body moved through unequal climates, even within the same building. Corridor, stair, chamber edge, bed. Each zone had a different bite. Portable warmth bridged those gaps. That thought becomes even more important when a king traveled, though we will come more fully to that later. For now, it is enough to feel the logic. Heat was a resource that could be carried in handfuls, in metal, in cloth, in stone, in containers, from one corner to another. The chamber becomes a map of short journeys made by warmth and by those who served it. Honestly, I think there is something almost beautiful in the stubbornness of these solutions. People looked at winter, at stone, at draft, at the simple misery of a cold bed, and answered not with despair but with objects. Clever little objects. Wrapped heat, enclosed embers, layered textiles, body parts protected one by one. Civilization often announces itself with cathedrals and law codes. It also announces itself with the sentence, "Perhaps we can make the bed a little warmer tonight." So let the tools gather around the bed now, in your mind. The warming pan already removed after its careful pass beneath the sheets. The heated stones wrapped and tucked low. The thick hose on the body. The cap ready. The brazier dimming in the corner. The foot warmer waiting. Each object humble on its own. Together they create a network of small defenses against the larger darkness pressing at the shutters. And yet the bed and its tools still do not finish the story. The king also had to carry warmth on his own body. Sleepwear mattered. Herbs mattered. Oils and hot drinks and beliefs about how to keep cold from entering the bones mattered. In the next movement, we will move from the bed to the body itself, the garments, remedies, and nighttime rituals that helped medieval rulers try to hold their heat from within once the curtains were finally drawn and the long winter hours began. Before we leave the tools entirely, keep one last image close. A servant lifting the curtain edge with one hand and feeling the stored warmth under the blanket with the other, not admiring the device itself, but judging the small weather it has made. That was the true measure of every pan. Stone, vestre, and brazier. Not elegance, not theory. A bed less hostile than it was an hour before. By the time the sheets had been warmed, the stones wrapped, and the bed curtains half ready to close, the source reminds us that one last battle still remained. The king's own body had to be prepared. A bed can help. A fire can help. A servant can help. But the body enters the night carrying its own weaknesses, its own exposed places, its own dangerous habit of losing warmth through skin, breath, hands, feet, and head. That is why medieval sleep clothing was never a trivial detail. It was part of the defensive system, almost a second bed worn on the body before the body ever touched the mattress. I have always found night clothing more interesting in old history than court dress. Court dress wants to be seen. Night clothing wants to survive until morning. That difference gives it a kind of honesty. No one ties a sleeping cap under the chin to impress a diplomat. No one pulls thick wool hose over tired legs at midnight because it flatters the profile. People do those things because cold strips vanity down to its useful bones. A freezing chamber can turn the most decorated monarch in Christendom into a practical animal in very little time. Imagine the king in the private moments before bed. The room is dimmer now. The louder movements of attendants have eased into smaller motions. A chair scraped once against stone is enough to sound abrupt. Linen lies waiting. A fur-lined pair of slippers or soft boots rests near the rug. Someone holds a candle lower, not higher. because too much light now would only make the room feel wider and colder. The king has stepped away from the outer garments of rank and into the inner garments of necessity. The source is right to linger over linen first. Heavy linen nightshirts mattered because linen was close to the skin in a way wool often could not be. Wool traps warmth beautifully, but against bare skin, it can irritate, scratch, and keep a sleeper too aware of his own discomfort. Linen, when good, gives a smoother first layer. It rests against the body, catches some moisture, holds a little warmth once warmed, and lets the upper layers do their work more effectively. I think that layering logic is one of the quiet triumphs of old domestic knowledge. One fabric greets the body, another guards it, another traps the air, another seals the whole arrangement. Picture the nightshirt being pulled over the shoulders. The cloth falls with a slower weight than modern sleepwear. Not cumbersome exactly, but substantial. It brushes the wrists. It settles around the knees or lower, depending on cut and status. At first, it may feel slightly cool, because almost everything in such a room begins cool. Then, within a minute or two, it begins taking on the heat of the wearer. That transformation matters. A garment that learns your temperature becomes an ally. A garment that never stops feeling separate becomes a mild enemy all night long. The source also mentions padded garments and quilted pieces, and I am glad it does, because this is where sleep begins looking almost military. A lightly padded upper layer, or an additional soft jacket, could help keep warmth close around the chest and shoulders, where breath and vital heat were believed to matter most. I have always liked the old idea that one sleeps inside a kind of reverse armor. By day, armor defended against steel. By night, padding and cloth defended against the invisible knives of winter. Then come the legs and feet, which the source treats with proper seriousness. Wool hose, thicker stockings, wrapped calves, and sometimes an extra protective layer over the feet were not signs of fussiness. They were signs of intelligence. Cold feet can ruin the mood of an entire night. The body may be mostly warm. The blankets may be well arranged. The head may rest comfortably. But if the feet remain chilled, the mind never quite believes in safety. It stays on alert, slightly insulted, slightly miserable, ready to wake at the smallest disturbance. Medieval people knew this by experience, long before anyone needed to explain it in scientific language. Imagine a servant kneeling to help pull a heavy wool stocking into place. The fabric grips, then yields, then settles. Another layer goes over it. Perhaps a soft indoor boot with fur or felt at the lining. Perhaps simply thicker wrappings intended to hold the first warmth that reaches the feet once the sleeper is inside the bed. These things were not elegant, though they could certainly be well made. They were merciful, and mercy, in a stone chamber at night, often looks less graceful than it feels. The source is especially evocative when it turns to the head. Caps at night, tied under the chin, sometimes lined, sometimes simple. This detail always charms modern readers because it looks faintly comic from a distance. But I think that reaction vanishes as soon as you imagine the actual air in the room. A sleeping cap is not comic in a chamber where the fire is dying and the window shutter does not quite respect your rank. It is sensible. Heat escapes. Ears ache. Scalp cools. Sleep breaks. The cap exists because the body loses too much through exposed places. And exposed places are where winter likes to begin its argument. You know that feeling when the tips of your ears go cold and suddenly the whole rest of you feels more vulnerable. That small misery has existed for a very long time. The source also points toward gloves and warmed hands, at least in harsher conditions. And though one might not sleep heavily gloved every night, the broader principle remains clear. Hands matter. A person may tuck them beneath blankets or close them under the arms or against the chest, but the hands still belong to the body's emotional geography. Cold hands make the whole self feel neglected. Warm hands convince the mind that rest is possible. This is why people have always rubbed them together near a fire, cupped them around a drink, hidden them inside sleeves, or slid them under blankets before trying to sleep. Medieval kings were no different, only better attended. And then the source enters one of the most intimate parts of the whole routine: the use of herbs, warm drinks, and warming balms. This is where the room begins smelling not just like smoke and wool, but like care. Lavender, perhaps. Rosemary. Mugwort. In some households, juniper. Sage. Spiced wine or warmed ale, or an herbal infusion brought late enough to soothe and early enough not to burden the stomach. It is one of my favorite turns in the whole story because it reminds you that winter discomfort is never only physical. People wanted the room to feel less raw, less damp, less like stone and soot and old air. Herbs did that. They gave the mind something gentler to inhabit. Imagine a small cup handed into the bed or offered just before entering it. Steam rising, thin but visible in the dim light. The smell warming the face before the liquid reaches the tongue. Honey, perhaps. Spice. Something medicinal enough to sound serious and pleasant enough to feel like indulgence. A warm drink does more than heat the stomach. It tells the body that the night is closing correctly, that the last cold tasks are ending, that inwardness is beginning. I have always thought bedtime drinks belong to a very ancient class of human magic. Ordinary magic. The sort that works because it persuades the body to stop expecting injury for the next few hours. The source also speaks of warming balms and oils, rubbed into the chest, hands, or feet. Again, this sounds quaint until you imagine the alternative. Skin dry from winter air, muscles tense from cold, hands stiff from contact with metal, stone, leather, and rains through the day. A warm oil rubbed into the feet near the fire would not solve everything, but it could change the terms of the night. It would soften the skin, increase the sensation of warmth, and give the mind one more signal that sleep was being prepared rather than stumbled into. Picture the lamp at the bedside. One servant holding it low, another rubbing balm into the instep or heel with a practiced economy of motion. The skin first shining, then drinking some of the oil. The scent lifting into the enclosed space around the bed. The body receiving one last small kindness before being turned over to blankets and darkness. There is something almost prayerful in such care, even when no prayer is spoken. The source goes further and includes beliefs that were partly medicinal and partly superstitious. And I think that blend is exactly right for the period. People feared cold, not just because it felt bad, but because they believed it could settle into the body, sink into the bones, disturb the humors, weaken the chest, invite illness, and make the old and young especially vulnerable. In such a world, a warming charm, an amber bead, a lavender bundle near the pillow, or a whispered protection against the long night would not feel absurd. It would feel responsible. Not everyone believed the same things in the same degree. Some scholars argue these practices varied enormously by region and status. We cannot be sure of every chamber and every household. Yet the larger truth remains. Medieval people treated warmth as physical and symbolic at once. To be cold was to be threatened. To be warmed was to be defended. I have always found amber especially fascinating in this context. A small bead or object close to the skin, warmed by the body, and believed in some cases to carry protective virtue. There is a beautiful logic to it, even if not all of it fits modern science. The stone is not simply decoration. It is touchable reassurance, warmth held in miniature, a token saying the body is not alone in the night. Likewise with lavender under the pillow or sewn into cloth. Smell is memory, and memory is comfort. The right scent can make a room feel less hostile and a bed feel more inhabited before sleep has fully begun. The source is also wise not to mock these beliefs. Mockery is easy from a distance. But if you were living inside such winters, inside rooms where medicine, prayer, smell, cloth, and heat all overlapped in daily experience, you would not separate them as neatly as a modern essay might. A person wants to survive the night. They take the warm drink. They accept the herb bundle. They rub the balm. They wear the cap. They ask the servant to tuck the blanket tighter. Practicality and symbolism sleep in the same bed. And then there is the chest, the lungs, the fear of cold air taken too deeply. The source hints at this in the medicinal language around keeping warmth near the core. That makes sense. A cough in winter could be trivial. It could also be the beginning of something worse. A chest kept warm, a throat protected, a draught avoided. These were not minor matters. They were part of preserving the ruler as a functioning body in a season that had no interest in his titles. You can feel that in the way bedding and clothing gather around the torso. Shirt, padding, blanket, fur, closed curtain, warm breath held under the canopy. It is almost like constructing a soft wall around the chest and throat. A living keep inside the larger keep. I find that image deeply persuasive. The king may rule the castle, but the castle of the night is built around his breathing. The source also suggests that bedtime itself could have a softer emotional rhythm than the rest of the day. A little conversation, a little quiet, a servant asking whether the feet are warm enough, whether another blanket is needed, whether the curtain should be more tightly drawn. These small questions matter. They are not only service, they are diagnostics. The room is being monitored through the king's body. Too cold at the shoulder, another fold. Too hot at the chest, Ease the top layer, a draft at the neck, adjust the curtain. The body becomes the instrument by which the success of the whole room is measured. I have always loved that because it makes comfort feel collaborative. The king is not passive, even while being served. He reports. He settles. He chooses how to turn, how to tuck the hands, how to place the feet near the last warmth in the bed. Warmth is made by many things, but finally, it must be inhabited skillfully too. So now the body is dressed, the nightshirt warmed by skin, the stockings in place, the cap tied, the hands no longer raw with chill, the scent of herbs faint but real, a little warmth in the stomach from drink, a little oil in the feet, the blankets drawn up, curtains nearly closed. We have moved from tools to flesh, from hearth to skin, and the body is as ready as it can be. But the source is not finished with the chamber yet, and neither are we. Because even when the body is clothed correctly and the bed is well prepared, the room around it still matters. The fireplace, the smoke, the walls, the tapestries, the hierarchy of who gets the warmest corner and who does not. All of these shape the final hours before sleep. In the next movement, we will widen from the dressed body back out to the whole chamber again, and feel how warmth in a medieval castle was never private for long. It was social, architectural, political, and always just a little unstable. Now the king is dressed for the night as well as the century can manage. Linen against skin, wool over it, stockings on the legs, cap tied, perhaps a little herb scent at the pillow, perhaps a little oil on the feet, perhaps the fading trace of warmed wine or spiced drink in the chest. The bed is ready. The body is ready. Yet the source does something very sensible here. It refuses to let us imagine that all the important work ends at the curtain edge. The room itself is still part of the story. The room is never neutral. It is partner, obstacle, witness, and threat all at once. I have always thought fireplaces are among the saddest objects in old castles. They look so hopeful. Great carved mantels, iron tools, broad hearths, charcoal glow, flames that move beautifully and seem, from across a room, as though they must surely be making everything comfortable. But anyone who has spent time in a large old stone house knows how deceptive that can be. A fire warms in zones. It flatters the face and neglects the feet. It comforts the eyes more than the walls. It gives courage at a distance where it cannot give temperature. The source is exactly right to insist that a medieval fireplace offered as much psychological reassurance as actual room-changing power. Imagine standing near one in the royal chamber. On one side of your body, the heat is welcome, almost luxurious. On the other side, the room is still cool enough to remind you not to linger too far from the flame. Turn away, and the truth returns immediately. The fire is a local monarch. Its kingdom is small. Everything beyond its reach remains in negotiation with the cold. That is why the room had to be thought of as a total thermal system. Tapestries on the walls mattered, not because they transformed stone into wool, but because they softened the immediate radiating chill and slowed drafts a little. Rugs mattered. not because they heated the floor, but because they interrupted the theft of warmth through the feet. Door hangings mattered. Window coverings mattered. Screens mattered. Furniture placement mattered. Even the placement of people mattered. The source is especially strong when it describes the smell of the room. And I think smell may be one of the best ways into the truth of these chambers. Smoke. Always some smoke. Not necessarily enough to choke, though sometimes perhaps close enough. Pineresin. Charred oak. Lanolin from wool. Dampness from stone that never quite forgets the weather. Herbs laid out or crushed under movement. Warmed metal. Leather. Wax. A little animal scent. A little human scent. The room is not clean in the modern antiseptic sense. It is inhabited. Thickly. Sensuously. Entirely. I have always found that more believable than any idealized version of royal life. A room can be wealthy and still smell like smoke and winter clothing. In fact, it probably must, if it is doing its work honestly. Picture the walls in low firelight. Tapestries shift slightly whenever the air moves. Not enough to flutter, just enough to betray the draft before your skin feels it. Their woven surfaces catch warm color from the flames. Hunts, saints, beasts, heraldic devices. Stories hung not only for memory and display, but for insulation. I like that very much. Art with a practical duty. Beauty has to hold back the cold as well as the eye. It gives the whole room a kind of humility beneath its grandeur. The source also reminds us that these rooms were deeply hierarchical in the way warmth was distributed. This matters a great deal. The king got the bed. The bed got the curtains. The bed got the thickest layers, the best position, the most careful preparation. Others did not. A guard by the door might have a cloak, movement, perhaps a stool or bench, perhaps a corner slightly favored by the hearth's reach. A page or attendant might sleep on a truckle bed, a pallet, or wrapped in blankets nearer the outer part of the room. The difference between inner warmth and outer cold was not an accident. It was rank made physical. I have always thought that is one of the most revealing things about royal comfort. Power is not only who eats best or dresses best. It is who sleeps nearest to stable warmth. The source lets this emerge quietly, and I think that is wiser than making it too loud. You notice it in arrangements. The king at the center, others in gradations around him. The more important the body, the more heat and fabric and labor converge upon it. Medieval rooms were social diagrams drawn in temperature. If you were standing in that chamber long enough, you could map hierarchy simply by where people were allowed to be comfortable. You know that feeling when you step away from a heater in a crowded room and immediately understand who has the best seat. Imagine that truth stretched across an entire system of service and architecture. Yet there is another side to this, one the source handles with tenderness. Warmth was not only political, it was social. Bodies warmed rooms. Conversation warmed rooms. The presence of others made private chambers less bleak and in some cases slightly less cold. A page rolled in blankets near the wall still contributed a little animal heat to the larger climate. A dog at the foot of the bed mattered. An attendant near the fire mattered. Even low voices before sleep mattered, because sound changes how cold feels. A silent room can feel colder than one with human softness in it. Imagine the chamber in the hour before everyone finally settles. The king perhaps already inside the bed curtains, an attendant making one last adjustment to the fire with the iron tool, bringing together two pieces of wood so that the coal bed will hold a little longer. Another checking the window latch. Someone else setting down a covered chamber pot, practical and not glamorous, but absolutely part of surviving the night without unnecessary exposure to the room. A quiet word, a sleepy murmur, a low apology for a small sound made too close to the bed. The whole atmosphere is a weave of rank and care. I have always liked that phrase too. Rank and care. One without the other would make the room feel less real. Of course there is hierarchy. Of course some people are colder, so one man can be warmer. But it is also true that medieval nights were communal in ways modern nights often are not. Sleep happened among witnesses. The king rarely vanished into total privacy. Warmth, even at its most privileged, still depended on a little society staying partly awake around it. The source also reminds us how much the architecture itself could betray the chamber. High ceilings were beautiful, impressive, worthy of a ruler, and terrible for heat. Warm air climbed where no one sleeping in bed could follow. Narrow windows blocked some weather and admitted enough air leakage to keep every winter room humble. Thick walls delayed change. Yes, but once they were cold, they gave that cold back slowly and without mercy. This is why the bed had to become a smaller weather inside the larger one. The room could not be trusted to hold all that was needed. If you walk from the hearth toward the farther side of such a chamber in imagination, you feel it in stages. The face cools first, then the hands. Then the space under the eyes seems sharper. The stone smell grows stronger and the fire smell weaker. The floor asks for attention through the soles. The tapestries no longer look romantic. They look useful. I think that transition is one of the best ways to understand these rooms. Warmth was never evenly spread. It was patchy, negotiated, political, contested. That patchiness becomes almost the moral map of the chamber. The source also touches on smoke control, or the lack of perfect smoke control, and that deserves more than passing attention. Fireplaces drew imperfectly. Chimneys could smoke back. The room could hold a haze, especially on bad weather nights, when the wind confused the flow. So even the great ally of heat came with penalties. Eyes might sting a little. Cloth might keep the smell. Walls darkened. People lived in this mixture because the alternative was worse. I think that may be one of the most ancient laws of domestic comfort. Real warmth is often untidy. Honestly, that may be why the room feels more believable the longer you sit with it. It is not an ideal system. It is a compromised system doing its best. And because the source is wise, it keeps returning to human adaptation rather than fantasy. People learned where to stand, where not to stand, how to place benches, how to use screens, when to close a curtain, when not to open a door, how to tuck blankets so the king could move without losing everything at once. Every chamber had its own habits. Every winter taught the room again. A draft that found one corner every year. A window seam that worsened in certain storms. A particular hanging that helped more than expected. Domestic knowledge accumulates like that. Quiet, practical, local, and deeply intelligent. I have always thought servants are the true historians of such rooms, even when they never wrote the history. They knew what the stone did in February. They knew which ember bed lasted. They knew which curtain edge failed. They knew when the king was likely to complain of the feet being cold, and when he would instead say the room was too smoky. That knowledge is not dramatic, but it keeps a winter chamber from becoming misery. The source also allows a little companionship to remain in the scene, and I am grateful for that, because too much emphasis on hardship alone can make historical rooms feel flatter than they were. There may have been a short exchange before lights lowered. A page told to sleep. A muttered joke. A reassurance that the fire would be watched. A final question through the curtain, whether the bedding is sufficient. These tiny moments matter. They soften the stone. They remind you that people live not only by blankets and embers, but by nearness. There is one more subtle thing the source makes clear if you stay with it long enough. Warmth in such a room had memory. The chamber remembered yesterday's fire. The bed remembered the body that last slept in it. The blankets remembered years of brushing, mending, and smoke. The servants remembered which side of the room turned cruel after midnight, and which side softened near dawn. Even the king remembered, in his body, where comfort would be found first. One corner of the mattress, one fold of blanket, one angle of shoulders turned from the draft. Medieval rooms taught habit, because habit was one of the only cheap forms of heat. To know where to stand, where to sit, when to tuck the hand under the chest, when to ask for another layer. All of that became part of the chamber's invisible equipment. I think that matters because it means warmth was never only material. It was also remembered technique, passed from winter to winter until the room itself seemed to have a character. Stern, smoky, imperfect, but not entirely unkind to those who knew how to live inside it. And this is the perfect point for the story to begin leaning toward the harsher nights. Because once the whole system is understood, the mind naturally asks what happened when the system was pushed hard. What happened in true storms? What happened on the road? What happened when the room was unfamiliar? The wind too fierce? The fire poorly drawing? The body overtired? That is where the source will go next. And it should. But before we leave this chamber as a system, hold it one more moment in balance. The hearth glowing, but limited. The tapestries beautiful, but practical. The rugs softening the floor, but not defeating it. The stone walls guarding the kingdom, but storing the cold. The bed, a kingdom within the kingdom. The king warmer than anyone else, but still not beyond winter. The servants colder than the king, but making his warmth possible. The dog curled in the right place. The smoke climbing. The draft searching. The room holding. I think that is one of the loveliest things the source gives us. A room full of contradictions that somehow, through attention and repetition, becomes bearable. Not perfect. Not modern. Not fair. But bearable. and perhaps that is enough to respect. In the next movement, the night will grow rougher, the weather louder, the architecture less cooperative, and the warmest place in the castle will have to prove itself against the meanest hours winter can offer. After the chamber has been understood as a whole weather system, after the bed, the curtains, the herbs, the servants, the smoke, the tapestries, the guards, and the zones of warmth and cold have all taken their places, the source leads us into the kind of night that tests every one of those preparations. The difficult nights. The nights when the castle does not merely feel cool and inconvenient, but actively embattled by winter. I think this is the right movement for the story, because comfort is easiest to imagine in theory and hardest to trust when the wind begins to strike the walls with intention. I have always thought storms reveal buildings more honestly than daylight does. In daylight, even a cold room can seem stately. The walls look strong. The windows look noble. The hearth looks promising. But let the weather turn. Let sleet scrape at shutters. Let hard rain turn to ice along the outer stone. Let the wind find every weakness in the joints of the structure. Then the building tells you the truth. It is holding, yes. It is shelter, yes. But it is also porous. It listens to the outside world whether it wants to or not. Imagine such a night gathering around the castle. Late afternoon darkens too early. The courtyard loses color. Water in buckets begins to crust at the edge. Men walking the wall stamp their feet harder. Horses in the stables sound more restless than usual. Somewhere a steward is already thinking ahead to fuel, to doors, to shutters, to whether enough dry wood has been brought inside. The source is right to insist that winter was never just an inconvenience in these places. It was logistics, anxiety, constant measured response. Then night arrives fully. The fire in the chamber matters more now, but so does every draft. A storm night in a medieval bedroom is not one sensation. It is 100 small sensations arriving together. A rattle at the shutters that repeats just irregularly enough to stay in the mind. A low moan in the chimney. The occasional change in flame when a pressure difference runs through the room. A thread of colder air finding the ankle through a place that felt safe an hour earlier. It is a night that keeps reminding you that warmth is provisional. The source understands this beautifully. Even the best bed, the best curtains, the finest wool, the best stocked hearth, all of it could feel newly fragile under bad weather. That does not mean the system failed entirely. It means the system was always relative. Warmest place in the castle did not mean warm by modern standards. It meant least bad. Most sheltered. The center of the defensive effort. I think that phrase matters enough to repeat in the mind. Least bad. Because it strips away romance without stripping away wonder. A king on a storm night was not lying in a perfect nest while winter politely remained outdoors. He was lying in the least punishing environment the castle could provide, and the distance between least punishing and fully comfortable could still be quite large. Picture the bed on such a night. Curtains drawn. Blankets layered. The king inside, perhaps half-propped, perhaps turned slightly on one side beneath the weight of wool and fur. At the foot, a warmed stone is cooling more quickly than hoped. The air inside the curtains is tolerable, even precious, yet no one in that bed would mistake it for summer. Beyond the curtain wall, the chamber goes on. Fire low. Guard at the door. Attendant, perhaps half asleep on a bench or pallet. Dog curled tightly into itself. Every living thing in the room made rounder by the cold, trying instinctively to preserve its center. The source also gives proper attention to sound, and I am glad it does. A storm changes sleep, not only through temperature, but through listening. You hear the building work. Timbers answer strain. Iron shifts against wood. The roof, somewhere far above, becomes an instrument you do not fully trust. The king might be safer than almost anyone else in the castle, yet safety is not the same as calm. A bad night can crawl into the mind through sound long before it reaches the body through cold. You know that feeling when one repetitive sound keeps you from dropping fully into sleep, not loud enough to demand action, just persistent enough to keep a portion of your mind on watch. Now imagine that in a world where weather could genuinely worsen illness, bring leakage, choke chimneys, freeze passages, and make morning labor more dangerous, the mind of the sleeper would not be entirely free. Royal or not, he would listen. That is one reason I find these histories oddly tender. A king on a storm night is still just a person, beneath blankets, listening to weather and hoping the room will hold. The source then widens beyond the fixed castle chamber and begins to suggest an even harder truth. Kings did not always sleep in their best prepared room. They traveled. They hunted. They campaigned. They moved between residences. They endured visits to less comfortable lodgings, fortified houses, monasteries, hunting lodges, improvised chambers in unfamiliar keeps. This matters enormously because it shows that the warmest place in a castle was already a compromise, and the warmest place outside that best chamber could become even more precarious. I have always liked the old travel details because they reduce rank to luggage. Cloaks, bedding rolls, furs packed for movement, portable braziers where possible, chests holding night garments and smaller warming tools. The source is right to stress this. Warmth had to travel with the king because architecture could not always be trusted to provide it. A smart household moved, not just silver and documents and ceremonial objects, but the means to survive the night. Imagine arriving at an unfamiliar lodging after a cold day on the road. Boots damp at the edges, hands not fully recovered from the journey, breath smoky in the corridor because the place has been heated too late or too poorly. The chamber prepared for the king may be the best in the building. Yes, but that does not mean much if the whole building has been soaking up winter for weeks. The bed is there. Perhaps a fire has been built in haste. Perhaps servants are already unpacking blankets and hanging what extra cloth they can. There is an urgency to such arrivals that the more stable castle bedroom does not have. At home, one knows the room. On the road, one negotiates with surprise. The source helps here by mentioning portable bedding and extra layers. And those details feel exactly right. Warmth is no longer a permanent arrangement. It is a campaign. Rolls of fabric opened. Furs shaken out. Stones heated in a new hearth whose temperament no one trusts yet. Bed curtains improvised if the frame is poor. Rugs thrown down where none had been. The king receives what can be assembled, but the process reveals how much of royal comfort depended on preparation and predictability. Strip away familiarity, and the body becomes more vulnerable again. I have always thought unfamiliar rooms are colder than familiar ones, even when the temperature is the same. Part of that is mental. Of course, you do not know the drafts yet. You do not know which wall leaks cold, which floorboard complains, which shutter will rattle, which fire draws smoke badly. Medieval travel multiplied that uncertainty. The bed may be dressed richly enough, but one still lies there, listening to a room that has not yet become known. The source also suggests that portable heat, though limited, mattered greatly in such circumstances. Heated stones wrapped for transport from hearth to bed. Foot warmers carried close. Additional cloaks layered over bed coverings. A body traveling with its own textile defenses because the room cannot be expected to contribute much. I love that image. The king arriving with warmth, folded into his baggage like a second form of power. Not glory exactly. Preparedness. And then there are the animals again. The source mentions them in passing earlier, but on harsher nights, their presence becomes even more understandable. Dogs especially. Perhaps a small hound near the foot. Perhaps another creature, kept close, more for companionship than heat. Though the heat helps. In a world without background warmth, living bodies mattered. A dog sleeping near you is a small furnace with a heartbeat and the added comfort of company in a room that may otherwise feel too large and too uncertain. Picture the king half awake in the small hours. The storm outside is not finished. The fire has settled lower. Inside the curtains, the air is still warmer than the room beyond, but cooler than it was when he first lay down. Somewhere near the foot, there is a subtle shift and a long sigh from an animal turning deeper into itself. That sound would matter. It would say life continues. The room is held by more than stone. The source also draws attention to the night watch. Guards, pages, attendants, anyone who remained nearby while the ruler slept. Their role in warmth is often indirect, but real. They kept the fire from failing completely. They listened for trouble. They adjusted shutters if wind shifted badly. They answered if the king woke and needed something moved, added, or removed. A room may have a center of heat, but it stays that way because someone at the colder edge keeps working. I have always liked that moral geometry. The warmest place in the castle rested on colder people, remaining awake around it. There is another dimension to these nights that the source only hints at, but which I think is worth feeling more fully. The king himself would have known that others in his world slept far worse than he did. Guards on the wall. Stable hands. Villagers outside the castle entirely. Monks in colder cells. Travelers on roads. Even if he did not think of them much, their existence gives the chamber a shadow. Royal warmth was a relative triumph. A privilege made visible by comparison. That does not make it unreal. It makes it humanly layered. You know that feeling when your own comfort becomes sharper because you can sense the discomfort beyond it. A blanket feels warmer in a room where you know someone else stands on watch in the draft. The source then returns us, wisely. to the smallest scale again. After the storm, after the road, after the travel bedding and the strange room and the moving wind, we come back to the final retreat. The king inside the bed. Curtains close. Layers adjusted. Feet finding the last of the stone warmth. Hands tucked inward. Breath slowly thickening the little enclosed climate around face and chest. This is the answer to the title in the deepest sense. The warmest place in the castle was not a hall or a throne or a chapel or a kitchen. It was this shrinking inner pocket where cloth, body, labor, and attention met. I think shrinking is the right word. Winter drove life inward, into smaller rooms, smaller circles of light, smaller conversations, smaller movements under blankets. Even greatness became small under enough cold. A king did not rule winter. He withdrew from it, strategically, layer by layer, until he reached the smallest space where sleep could happen. Before we leave this movement, stay with one last storm image. The shutters sound once, hard and sudden. The dog does not wake. The guard at the door shifts his stance but says nothing. Within the curtains, the sleeper turns slightly. The blankets pull closer. The warmed air survives. Outside the bed, the chamber is a compromise. Outside the chamber, the castle is a compromise. Outside the castle, winter remains what it has always been. Vast, patient, indifferent. The miracle is not that it has been banished. The miracle is that inside all this stone and dark, a little human warmth still holds. And that is where the story should lean as it approaches its end. Not toward conquest, but toward fragile endurance. One body, one bed, one room, one night at a time. In the final movement, we will let the chamber grow even quieter. Follow the last embers, the last breath, the last little adjustments before sleep, and then leave the king where all this labor was meant to leave him. Not perfectly comfortable, not untouched by cold, but enclosed in the warmest refuge his world knew, while the winter waits outside until morning. There is one more thing I do not want to leave out before we pass onward. Storm nights also changed the imagination of everyone in the room. The bed looked more precious. The fire looked smaller. The walls looked thicker and less trustworthy at the same time. Even the curtains around the royal bed seemed to take on extra seriousness, as though the fabric itself had accepted a duty. I think that matters because objects in hard weather stop being decorative and become companions. A blanket is no longer just cloth. A shutter is no longer just a cover. A rug is no longer just furnishing. Every item declares whether it is helping or failing. Winter is a ruthless judge of usefulness. That same judgment followed the king on the road. A badly prepared lodging, a poor fire, a thin mattress, a missing fur, a delayed servant. Any one of these could turn an ordinary cold night into a long physical trial. That is why travel accounts and household records can sound so fussy to modern ears. They are not fussy. They are realistic. People who knew stone cold from the inside paid close attention to every condition that stood between them and it. If we laugh a little at the number of coverings, boxes, wraps, portable comforts, and special arrangements, we should do so gently. because all of them were attempts to preserve the one thing that makes human life bearable after dark in winter. Enough warmth to trust sleep. So let the storm outside continue a little longer. Let the shutters answer it. Let the watch remain watchful. Let the dog turn once more. Let the king sleep inside the smallest kingdom he truly controls. That is where we will leave him for now, gathered inward, while the castle spends the rest of the night listening to the weather on his behalf. Now the chamber has grown as quiet as it can grow without becoming entirely empty, and the source allows the story to fold inward at last. No more large descriptions of architecture. No more inventories of cloth and fur and metal and herbs. No more corridors, unless memory drifts back to them. Only the final little world that all those preparations were trying to create. A sleeping body. A curtained bed. A fire breathing low at the edge of exhaustion. Guards somewhere beyond the reach of comfort. Winter waiting outside with the patience only weather possesses. This, I think, is the most honest ending possible for a story like this. I have always thought that the last moments before true sleep are among the most revealing in all of history, because there is so little left to pretend with. The work of the day is done. Titles no longer warm the hands. Even anxieties begin to lose their sharpness if the body is tired enough. The bed either receives you or it does not. The room either lets you drop into rest or keeps you half awake with small punishments. One ankle cold, one shoulder exposed, one strange sound at the shutter, one last ember failing sooner than hoped. Medieval kings knew that as well as anyone. Perhaps better than some, because so much effort had gone into making their night survivable that every remaining discomfort would be felt more clearly, not less. The source keeps returning to this idea that the warmest place in the castle was made, not found. I think that sentence could almost serve as the whole final meditation. Made. By labor. By textiles. By fuel. By clever tools. By the memory of many winters. By servants who knew where the drafts ran. By animals who curled in the right corners. By guards who stayed awake. By the body of the sleeper, contributing its own heat to the little climate that gathered around it. Nothing about this warmth was accidental. That is why it feels so fragile and so moving. Picture the king once more, but now not as figurehead, not as owner of the room, not as lord of the castle, only as the inhabitant of the bed. His face has softened in sleep or near sleep. One hand, perhaps, rests under the blanket near the chest. The shoulders have found a position in which the weight of coverings no longer feels oppressive but securing. The cap is shifted slightly. The breath enters the enclosed air, leaves it, and enters again. Every exhale helps warm the little pocket around the face. Even sleep becomes a form of work for the body, holding its climate against the night. I think that is one reason curtain beds feel almost sacred in old winter stories. Not because they are grand, but because they gather the human down into a scale the world cannot instantly crush. The castle is huge. The winter is larger still. The bed says, shrink. Come inward. Reduce the world until survival is possible. There is wisdom in that, and maybe a little comfort for modern listeners too. Not every battle is won by expansion. Some are won by making a smaller circle of light and remaining inside it. The source also leaves us with the fire, and I am glad it does, because the fire is the room's last visible heartbeat. It is no longer bright enough to dominate the chamber. Its great work is done. Now it glows inwardly. Red under ash. A settling sound now and then as some small structure within the wood gives way. The occasional pulse of brighter orange when a hidden coal finds a little breath. The fire cannot warm the whole room anymore. Perhaps it never could. Yet it still matters. It keeps dread from becoming total darkness. It keeps a little motion in the chamber. It gives the eye one soft place to rest if the sleeper wakes. You know that feeling when you wake in the night and the room is still dark, but there is one small sign that the world has not vanished. A clock light, a street lamp at the curtain edge. In a medieval chamber, it might be the ember glow, just enough to keep the mind from feeling abandoned. Outside the bed curtains, the room continues its own slower sleep. The guard by the door is not fully comfortable. That should be remembered. He has his cloak, perhaps a bench, perhaps a place to lean, perhaps a little movement left in his feet to keep blood flowing. But he does not have the inner climate the king has. The source never lets hierarchy vanish, and it should not. Warmth follows power. Yet I think the final quiet of the room softens that truth with another one. Everyone in the chamber is engaged in the same basic human act, holding off the cold until dawn. That includes the animal curled near the hearth or bed. I keep returning to that because I find it such a perfect image of pre-modern warmth. The dog sleeping without shame in a good thermal position. The old practical intimacy of species sharing shelter. No theory in it. Just body beside body. Warmth beside warmth. Night endured together. History can be grand and solemn, and then a hound sighing in its sleep makes all of it suddenly gentle. The source also suggests, without pressing too hard, that sleep itself may have felt different then because the night was different. Darker, more broken, more audible, more tied to the rhythms of fire and weather than to any abstract clock. I think that is surely true. Sleep in such a room would come in layers, not always in one smooth descent. A settling, a half-waking, a turn beneath the blankets, a return. The body learning again and again that it is still inside the circle of warmth. That too is part of the tenderness here. Rest was not perfect. It was renewed in small recoveries. Honestly, I think there is something deeply human in that pattern. Many kinds of peace arrive that way. Not all at once, but in returns. And morning, when it comes, does not erase the truth of the night. The source hints at dawn as a kind of reopening of the world. The curtains are drawn back. The first cold of the room touches a face that had been warm under linen and wool. The sleeper remembers, instantly, where the warmest place had been. Inside. Behind. Within the gathered fabric. The room itself is larger now, grayer, less forgiving. The fire must be built up again. The body must leave the cocoon. The day resumes its demands. I have always thought that first touch of room air at dawn is one of the loneliest and clearest moments in winter life. For 1 second, you know exactly how much mercy the bed was giving you, because you have stepped out of it. The source therefore ends not with triumph, but with proportion. Medieval kings did not conquer winter inside their castles. They reduced its reach. They delayed its bite. They concentrated what warmth they could into one carefully defended place. The warmest place in the castle was not warm because the castle itself was kind. It was warm because people had made one small refusal inside a much colder structure. That refusal matters to me. It makes the story feel less like quaint history and more like something permanent in human life. We all build small refusals against the cold that reaches us. Physical cold, yes, but also the larger, colder things. Fatigue, fear, loneliness, the vastness of what we cannot control. A medieval bedchamber simply makes that visible in cloth and embers. So let the final image be very simple. The winter night outside, immense and patient. The castle around it, thick, proud, imperfect, listening. The chamber within the castle, dim, smoky, layered, watched. The bed within the chamber, curtained, weighted, warmer than anything beyond it. The sleeping king within the bed, no longer a symbol, only a body at rest. The little ember glow beyond the curtain folds, the long, slow breathing of man and dog and room. The knowledge that this is enough for now. I think that is what the source has really been teaching all along. The warmest place in a medieval castle was not a location in the grand architectural sense. It was a condition of care, gathered around a bed until a body could stop resisting the night. It was wool and fur, and linen and herbs and smoke and service and rank and attention and memory and luck. It was all those things at once. And even then, only just enough. There is a softness in that conclusion that I do not want to lose. The king did not sleep in invulnerability. He slept in a pocket of defended humanity. The same stones that protected him from enemies also made the room hard to warm. The same curtains that signaled dignity trapped the breath that kept him comfortable. The same servants who vanished from official glory kept him from misery. The whole castle becomes a lesson in contradictions, and the bed, at the center, becomes the gentlest contradiction of all. A small place of tenderness, built inside a machine for war. So if you carry anything away from this story, let it be that image. A winter fortress, and inside it, a tiny weather made by human effort. A king who, for all his status, still needed blankets arranged just right. A room where every softer detail had to struggle to exist. A night that could not be fully defeated, only softened. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what comfort has always really been. Not the banishment of hardship, but the creation of one small, survivable world within it. The embers sink lower now. The guard remains on watch. The dog sleeps on. The blankets hold. Beyond the shutters, the cold has not changed its mind. It does not have to. Dawn will come soon enough. But for these last hours, the warmest place in the castle still exists, held together by cloth, breath, memory, and care. And for one more little stretch of darkness, that is enough. There is one more tenderness in the source that I think deserves to be held a little longer before the last line arrives. The bed was not only the warmest place in the castle because it trapped heat. It was the warmest place because all the hardness of the building seemed to stop at its edge. Stone ended there. Ceremony ended there. Public life ended there. Even fear of displeasing a ruler softened into quieter duties once the curtains closed. On the other side of the fabric there was still rank, of course, but there was also something simpler. A tired body hoping not to wake cold. That simplicity feels almost holy after so much structure. Imagine the heavy curtain from the inside now. Not its rich color seen by others, but its nearness. Fabric only inches from the face if the sleeper turned toward it. A soft wall. A dark wall. A wall that moved a little when the air outside shifted, yet did not fully yield. I have always thought that enclosed beds must have changed the imagination of sleep itself. The sleeper was not lying in a large room. He was lying in a chamber made of cloth and breath, a smaller night suspended within the larger one. Even the sound of the guard, the dog, the settling fire, reached him softened, as if the bed translated the world into something gentler before allowing it through. And perhaps that is the final secret behind the title. Warmth was never only temperature. Warmth was enclosure, nearness, reduced exposure, the sense that the night had been narrowed to manageable size. A person can endure a great deal if the world becomes small enough around them for a few hours. The medieval royal bed did exactly that. It reduced the kingdom to blanket, pillow, breath, and ember. It turned winter from a continent into a border. I like that image very much. Winter as a border. It reminds us that the king did not abolish the season. He pushed it back a little. A few feet, a few layers, a few hours. And in that little retreat from discomfort, sleep became possible. Not guaranteed. Not luxurious in the lazy modern sense, but possible. Sometimes that is the highest form of comfort any age can really offer. So the final room remains before us, one last time. The shutters hold. The walls listen. The curtains keep their private duty. The bed accepts the body. The body gives its heat to the bed and receives some back. The dog stays where warmth has taught it to stay. The guard keeps to his station because that is the geometry of power and care in this small midnight world. The fire lowers itself into patience. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the mercy. Nothing dramatic happens. The night is survived by the absence of disaster, by the success of all the little preparations whose names no one remembers by morning. And when dawn finally comes, pale and slow and unenthusiastic, it does not cancel the truth of the dark hours. It only reveals what they required. Blankets thrown back. Steam no longer visible from breath because the body has moved and the room has claimed its chill again. The floor waiting below with its old theft. The hearth needing life once more. Servants waking themselves back into motion. The king stepping out of the one warm island that had been built for him and re-entering the stone day. That contrast tells the whole story in a single sensation. Behind him, the warmest place in the castle. Before him, everything else. Good night.